I'm Mo Rocca, and I'm excited to announce Season 4 of my podcast, Mobituaries. I've got a whole new bunch of stories to share with you about the most fascinating people and things who are no longer with us. From famous figures who died on the very same day, to the things I wish would die, like buffets. All that and much more. Listen to Mobituaries with Mo Rocca wherever you get your podcasts.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It is Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, my brother? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, man. Chilling as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. That Happy New Year might be outdated by the time this is released because I don't think this is going to be released right away. So
Nope, probably not.
it might be a couple of weeks after.
Well, it'll probably be the first or the second, that you hear this year. So, same shit.
Same shit. So it is January 3rd right now, 10:10 p.m. So it's late. We are getting tired. And it's always fun when you're talking about sensitive. It's always great to talk about sensitive topics while you're tired.
Mm-hmm.
While you can mess up. It's the best time to do it.
Yep.
Well, you're not 100%, but I mean, these are the cards that we've been dealt. We record at late at night. But how was the holiday season for you?
It was pretty good, man. I got a 360-degree camera, which is super cool. And we just sat on our balcony and watched the fireworks because in Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans happen to like fireworks more than anyone I've ever met, any group of people I've ever met before. They use fireworks on a random Tuesday just because. So New Year's is a big event, and it literally sounds like a war zone. I'll send you the video, but there's a really cool 360-degree video that you can see from my balcony. You've been on my balcony, so you know panoramic views of the city and the island and the water. And you just see explosions happening everywhere. It was super cool. How about you?
It was pretty cool. It's pretty cool. So my son had RSV, so that wasn't great.
What is that?
On Christmas. It's a respiratory virus that most people get, but it's bad when babies get it.
Okay.
So he was sick, but he was fine. He wasn't too sick. It wasn't anything that was too concerning. But that was fun. But it was also fun just going through Christmas the first time with a kid, even though he's too young to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
I mean, he obviously has no idea. Like, he understands the wrapping paper. He likes to pull it, and he sees the different colors, and he wants to put it in his mouth. But he has no concept of gifts or anything like that. But I mean, it's fun to finally shop for a baby.
I got your Christmas
I've shopped
card,
for
by
other
the way.
babies. Oh, thank you. What'd you think of it?
It was hilarious. I loved it.
Yeah, little Jay with a bow tie.
Yeah, it was cool.
So something that you'll appreciate. The other day, I saw Lord of the Rings on HBO. So the extended versions, and I haven't seen Lord of the Rings in a long time. Maybe 5-6 years I haven't watched it. And whenever there's a movie that you really loved growing up, and Lord of the Rings was my favorite film ever when I was a kid. I used to watch it nonstop. It's always interesting to watch it and see, like, does the movie hold up now? Does it hold up for modern audiences? And I watched it.
The answer is always no.
And, well, in this case, I'm happy to say that Lord of the Rings absolutely does hold up to modern special effects and to modern, huge blockbuster extravaganza type films. Plus the story is just better because it's Tolkien, and man, that was fucking awesome. Even though James couldn't understand it,
I'm sure he loved it.
He absolutely loved it until the end, where he's like, hey, why didn't the Eagles just fly Frodo and Sam to Mount Mordor to begin with?
Right.
And I said, you know what, James?
So much easier.
Shut up. Just shut up. All right? Just shut up. Because Sauron would have solved them. That's what would have happened.
You'll find out when you're older.
And then he was like, why did Aragorn let that snake who was possessing the king of Rohan, why did he let him escape? Don't you know that led to Solomon knowing where the weakness of Helm's Deep was, leading to the death of hundreds of elves and Rohan soldiers? Come on. Huge fuck up right there.
I know. I know.
Why didn't they just capture him? Why didn't they just put him in prison if they didn't want to murder him? And I said, shut up. Stop, you're spoiling it for me. The plot holes are very minor compared to other films like Star Wars.
Well, depends on which Star Wars we're talking about, but yeah.
We had a whole discussion. I guess they solved this problem, with the exhaust port in not the first one, episode 4, where it's like, why do you have an exhaust port that
will blow up the entire Death Star?
Well,
Yeah.
Why does it suck things in instead of push things out, like push energy out?
I don't know that it sucked it in. I think that was just like weird, like the proton torpedo physics, like strange proton torpedo physics.
Yeah, but then they made a stupid movie to cover that plot hole. So whatever. I guess it is what it is.
Well, they're trying to retcon. They're trying to retcon a lot of like the newest movies with a lot of these TV shows, but we don't need to go down that rabbit hole just yet. Let's just jump into the actual topic of the day.
Okay, so we are talking about the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995.
Yep.
And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is obviously the current situation, the current war on Gaza, and really I think it explains a lot about how we're here and how the peace process failed, and fundamentally how Israeli society has really shifted over the past, really since the 1967 war. Mm-hmm. So I thought this was a pretty interesting topic to cover and to explore in more detail. And I guess to start this off. So Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, November 4th, 1995, he's assassinated. Mm-hmm. And he's assassinated by a Benjamin Netanyahu fan, essentially. An ultra-right Orthodox Jew named Yigal Amir. And he was murdered in response to the signing of the Oslo Accords in September of 1993. And with Rabin's death, effectively it erased any type of promise made about returning occupied territories to the Palestinians.
Yep. All right, just before we get too deep, because it's about to get real deep, just so we're all on the same page, maybe we should start with, who was Yitzhak Rabin?
Sure. So Yitzhak Rabin, he served 2 terms as prime minister. He was head of the Labor Party. His first term was in 1974 to 1977. Then his second term was from 92 to 95. When he returned in 92, Likud had been in power for the past 13 of the 15 years. So Menachem Begin, he was prime minister from from 1977 to 1983. And then he resigned due to, controversies in the war in Lebanon. Yitzhak Shamir took leadership of the party. And then Shimon Peres was prime minister between 84 and 86. And this was the only period when Likud was not in power. However, Shamir came back in power in 86. So when Rabin won the election in 92, people thought there could be a shift in Israel's ever-growing strain of religious nationalism. Because remember, the early Zionists weren't religious nationalists. They were secular ethnic nationalists. And we'll get into that transition later in this episode.
Right. I think it's important to remember that, a lot of these early Zionists were these like hard-nosed military guys. And Rabin was one of them. I mean, he was the head of the IDF during the 67 war, and he was the defense minister from 84 to 1990. So during that first intifada. And this is after Ariel Sharon was forced to resign due to the massacring Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut by a Christian militia, which was allied with the IDF there. But side note, anyway, before 1948, Rabin was the commander of what was called the Haganah, and the Haganah, along with the Irgun and the Stern Gang, or Lehi, these were the main Jewish paramilitary organizations during the British Mandate period in Palestine. And Haganah was the armed wing of this organization called Jewish Agency for Palestine, which was the operational branch of the World Zionist Organization founded by Theodor Herzl. The Jewish Agency for Palestine was pretty much the primary organization that oversaw and promoted a lot of the Jewish immigration to Palestine. For example, Ben-Gurion was the president until the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. And Haganah here means defense force. So you can think of them as like the precursors to the IDF. And the Haganah is accused of perpetrating many of the ethnic cleansing campaigns in 1948 and in 1947. So in these cases, Yitzhak Rabin personally ordered the expulsion of Lida, which was when 50,000 or over 50,000 Arabs were marched out of that city into refugee camps, and many of them died along the way. You can think of that as a ethnic cleansing of sorts, depending on your definition there. Now, I don't mean to get too far into the history of the 47 or 48 war. There's a lot that goes on there. The point I'm trying to make is that Rabin wasn't a peacenik, right? He wasn't like this peace-loving guy. He did some things, and he was part of some military organizations. But Rabin, he represented the views of a lot of the early Zionists who were happy to have this kind of 80-20 majority in Israel, 80 being Israeli, 20 being non-Israeli or Arabs. And they believed that the bulk of the West Bank shouldn't be settled by Israel because they understood that inevitably by taking over the West Bank, that would bring more Arabs under their rule, which would dilute the Jewish state, right? There'd be fewer Jewish majority, smaller Jewish majority, if at all. And this early secular nationalist wanted the Jews to be this dominant racial majority in the Jewish state. And this came at odds with what religious Orthodox expansionists had in mind, which was that the Jews should take over all of Judea and Samaria. So kind of creates a little bit of tension between the two. Nevertheless, neither of them were like peace-loving in that respect.
Yeah, and I guess a good way to put it is that the early Zionists were, if nothing else, they were definitely pragmatist. Mm-hmm. They understood that if they were going to take on more land especially in the West Bank, that ultimately that would, like you said, dilute the purity of a Jewish state. Right. Because what are they going to do with all these Arabs?
Right.
And ultimately, that would just lead to all sorts of other problems. Now, the origins of this conflict is really the 67 war. The origins really go back a lot further than that, really to the early Zionist movement. But the direct origins to the conflict are the 67 war. The 67 war ruins the secular nationalist goal of having their 80-20 majority in Israel. And after the war, they started occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. So around 1 million or so Palestinians were now under their control. So the primary question is, what do they do with all these people who they now occupy? Because if they gave non-Jew citizenship, or all, there's some Jews, there's some Arab Israeli citizens, but if they gave all these other Arabs citizenship or non-Jews citizenship, Muslims and, mostly Muslims and Christians, Israel would cease to exist as a Jewish state because they would no longer be the majority, or a very slim majority, which would eventually be overtaken. So the solution to this is that, well, the obvious solution is that, okay, so why don't we give them their own state? So why don't the Palestinians get their own state, which is, the two-state solution?
Right. But the problem here, though, was that the Israelis started building settlements in the occupied territories that they were proposing that the Palestinians have as their own state, which ruins this, Palestinian state's territorial integrity, right? And they were Israelis, especially members of religious organizations, which saw these territories, and specifically the West Bank, as just like this integral part of greater Israel. And, there were other Israelis, on the other hand, who saw the occupation of the territories as a way to gain peace through like a land for peace proposal. So basically hey, if we take this over now, we can use it as a bargaining chip for later to get peace. So it was like a weird intersection between people who wanted to keep it and people who wanted it just as a bargaining chip that was promoting more land grabs in what was the obvious solution to not diluting the Jewish state. Nevertheless, though, occupying millions of people with no political solution or hope becomes very unsustainable. And this situation leads to the first Intifada in 1987. Intifada here, the word meaning uprising or to shake off. And there was an incident where 4 Palestinians were killed by an Israeli military truck in Gaza, which kicked this off. And we don't really know if it was on purpose or if it was an accident or not. That part is kind of unclear, but nevertheless, that was the stated reason for the first Intifada in 1987.
Yeah, so 1980s is a pretty crazy time in Israel. There's obviously the war in Lebanon. There's the Intifada. And there is, a lot of instability. It was really kind of the Intifada that compels the Bush administration to prioritize a peace process, Bush Sr. And Secretary James Baker took the lead on this. After the Gulf War, George Bush Sr., he thought he had this grand opportunity to push a peace on the Israelis. So he was really trying to exploit the goodwill and the political capital from winning the war to create a peace conference, which would also be co-sponsored by, what was left of the Soviet Union. So the Madrid Conference was created, and it was the first ever direct talks between Israel, the Palestinians, Syria, and then the Gulf countries. And really, the Madrid Conference was there was 3 tracks of direct negotiations arranged between Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon, and then Israel and Jordanian Palestinian joint delegations. There was no representation of the PLO at the Madrid Conference. And the reason why is because Arafat had supported Saddam Hussein during Iraq War I. So Arafat, he joins the Madrid Conference as part of the Jordanian delegation. Now, the Madrid Conference really doesn't go anywhere. And I'm not going to get too far into why it doesn't. Negotiations break down. And something I find really interesting is how the Bush administration was completely hammered by Jewish lobby groups, specifically AIPAC. George Bush Sr., for all of his faults, is the last president to really stand up to the Israelis. And one of the reasons that Rabin beat Shamir in the election of 92 is because Shamir, he couldn't secure loan guarantees that would be used for Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union to new settlements. Bush said that he would freeze them. He basically said, if the money is going to be used to create new settlements, I'm blocking it. So there's this famous story about James Baker and Bush, where they were asked about how Jewish groups were acting hostile towards them, and James Baker famously said, "Fuck them. They didn't vote for us anyway." And let me just say that I'm quoting that so no one could take me out of context.
Yeah.
But he was referring to the fact that most American Jews largely vote Democrat.
Right.
Now, the Bush administration, they saw Rabin as a likely partner for peace, but Bush ends up losing the '92 election to Clinton. And a lot of people think, and I think it is a big part of it, that Bush Sr. lost his election largely due to the Israel lobby. But that's a topic for another day. Now, what is important to note, even though Bush loses the election, there really is still enough political will and still enough really reputations on the line that the peace process does continue with the Clinton administration. So when Rabin became prime minister in '92, he's immediately saddled with the responsibility of this peace process.
Right. And when he gets elected, Rabin orders a freeze on all of the settlement construction. Rabin, being the defense minister during that intifada, he understood that the burden, that there was like an inherent burden of occupying territory. Like we said earlier, he also understood that expanding the borders of Israel could potentially bring non-Jews into the state, which would dilute that ethnic purity that they were going for. So it was just generally against, those expansions. And as those negotiations began following the June election, it became clear that the Palestinians that were attached to the Jordanian delegation in Washington, they were receiving instructions from the PLO directly. So Rabin was just like, hey, let's just talk directly with one another. That is, Israel and the PLO talk directly instead of through, their Jordanian delegation in Washington. So this formalized what began in December of '92 as the Oslo process, which I'm sure many people have heard of. 8 months later, the Oslo process basically ended in the agreement known as the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO, and the formal signing ceremony that was held in Washington a month later on September 13th by President Clinton, Rabin, and Arafat together at the White House. Oslo established a framework to transfer governance of the West Bank and Gaza Strip from the State of Israel to a Palestinian interim self-government authority. Man, that's a mouthful. It's just now known as the Palestinian Authority. And that authority was supposed to have jurisdiction over education, culture, health, social welfare, direct taxation, and tourism, but not foreign or defense issues and Israeli settlements, nor their Jewish inhabitants, right? So that was a notable thing that they didn't have control over. And these...
Yeah, I mean, they were a state with autonomy. They weren't like a sovereign nation, but they were like how Greenland is to Denmark, or what? Right. Greenland's part of Denmark, right? Or did I get that correct? Or is it Norway? No, regardless.
Denmark, yeah.
Denmark. It's like Greenland is to Denmark, but imagine Greenland inside Denmark, but they wouldn't control their own foreign policy. Most importantly, which is a territory within an autonomous zone,
military or anything like that.
An autonomous zone with their own police force and their own rights for culture preservation and things like that.
Right. So these negotiations, they actually took place in secret in, obviously, Oslo, in Norway. And it came up with a few outputs. So one of them was the Declaration of Principles, or the DOP, which established a timetable for the gradual transfer of authority from Israel to Palestine, to the Palestinian interim government, that is, in both the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It also provided for the creation of a Palestinian intern self-government authority. That's the Palestinian Authority, basically, to administer the West Bank and the Gaza Strip during that interim period. It also stipulated a phased withdrawal. Excuse me, phased withdrawal. Phrased. It stipulated a phased withdrawal of Israeli military forces from parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The withdrawal was obviously intended to create conditions for the establishment of that Palestinian Authority. Kind of hard to do that when you have an occupying force there, And the Oslo Accords also led to the creation of the actual Palestinian Authority that we know now, that was chaired by Yasser Arafat. And the PA granted basically limited self-governance power over those specified areas that we were talking about. And then finally, the Accords outlined these plans for democratic elections to be held in the occupied territories to establish basically the formal leadership of the Palestinian Authority. And that's what the negotiations came to.
Yeah, and just to pull this back, the concept behind Oslo had its origins in the 1978 Framework for Peace in the Middle East, which was one of the primary documents of the Camp David Accords, which was signed in Camp David by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, and brokered by Jimmy Carter. Since then, this idea has been the basis of really Israeli and U.S. policies, and the cornerstone, or I shouldn't say current, but it's been kind of the basis of the charade of U.S. and Israeli policy, or the basis of any type of peace initiative that would take place. Now, the reality of it is that it didn't acknowledge the reality that the occupation needed to end in order for this to work. But the framework clearly stipulated full autonomy for the people, and negotiations on the final status of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were based on UN Resolution 242. However, its main weakness was in its failure to recognize the Palestinians as the political representation of Palestinians.
Basically, recognizing that Palestinians exist and that they have a political and popular representatives.
Yeah, as people, as holders of any type of political power.
Right.
That's an easier way to say it.
Exactly.
But pulling this back to the Oslo Accords, to the hard right in Israel, the Oslo Accords are a moral shock. So the Oslo Accords contradicted the expectation that post-1967 territorial expansion was the beginning of the linear and irreversible progress towards the messianic advent and the redemption. You see, after the 67 war, there was a fusion of religion and Zionism. So remember, Zionism in its earliest conception, the early Zionists, a lot of them were atheists. The reason why there was such a push to have the Jewish state in Palestine in the first place is just because it's kind of like it's just like why any nation state has this kind of connection to this mythological past, because it sells better. It's like a cool story. It's like, we're going back to our homeland. This is where our blood's from.
Right.
But it wasn't really, these guys weren't
religious
religious fanatics at all. A lot of the religious Jews in the world were not Zionist at the time. Mm-hmm. They were against it. Now, there's a term called ideotheology, and this is a term by Dr. Clive Jones, which I sourced a lot for this. So the conviction that Zionism was a necessary precursor to what religious nationalists believed was the arrival of the Messianic era found a particular resonance after 1967. The capture of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the biblical heart of Eretz Israel, against apparently overwhelming odds, soon acquired messianic overtones. So some Orthodox Jews believe that the Messiah would reunite the Jews with the biblical land of Israel, whose boundaries are stipulated into the Torah. So the capture of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which is the biblical heart of Eretz Israel, had these messianic overtones. So I'll quote Clive Jones again. The real impact of the religious right was to redefine the normative character of Zionism. While never a single cohesive ideology, Zionism was nonetheless an amalgam of ideas drawn from Jewish philosophy, history, and religion, on the one hand, infused with the universal values of freedom, democracy, and justice for its Jewish citizens, values identified with Western civilization. While the period of 1948 and 67 never saw the complete synthesis of these ideas, close association with universal values marked the development of an Israel rather than a Jewish identity. The June 1967 marked a watershed in this process with the affirmation of particular Jewish rather than universal values in determining the character of the State of Israel. These particularist values increasingly influenced the political agenda in Israel after 1967, a process accelerated by the election of the first Likud-led coalition government under Menachem Begin in 1977. This also led the religious right to reject the theory of normalization outlined by Herschel and other classical Zionist thinkers. In this respect, the October War of 1973 was of particular significance. In the June Six-Day War was interpreted as signifying divine intervention in hastening the process of redemption. The Yom Kippur War signified the continued rejection by Gentiles of Jews as a people, and an attempt to undermine the Messianic age into which Jews as a people had now passed. Maintaining the integrity of Eretz Israel remained the supreme goal of religious nationalists and formed the core component of their ideotheology. Clear reference was made to the covenant made between God and Abraham regarding the land as an everlasting possession, a promise that is repeated by God, according to the book of Genesis, to Abraham's son Isaac and to his son Jacob. As long as successive Israeli governments, albeit on security grounds, continued to value Jewish control over the territories captured in 1967, a clear symbiosis of objective existed with religious nationalism. As such, submitting to the secular authority of the Jewish state possessed little real difficulty. Nonetheless, by regarding the land as central to the redemptive process of the Jewish people, it followed that any attempt to trade land for peace usurped the will of God and therefore would be opposed. This position brought to the fore the centrality of halakha, the doctrine, rules, and laws of Judaism that through the centuries had been codified into judicial law.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's interesting to see how Zionism gets, I don't, for lack of a better word, co-opted by the religious right, or at least the folks that were really trying to accelerate, the Messianic age. It kind of feels a lot like, our episode on the Christian Zionists, and the the religious rights there, the folks that wanted to speed up the, Armageddon by getting the Jews back to their homeland, right? There's an interesting parallels there, and it's fascinating how that intersection between secular Zionists and these hardcore like religious right folks, and how
Well, just think about it this way. Why would, and this is going to sound pretty crude, but like, why would a Jew from America, an American Jew, or, you know, maybe a British Jew, or wherever, who has a comfortable life, want to get up, move into the desert, and go to a place that's dangerous? Frankly, you know, there's been a series of wars. Mm-hmm. Everyone in the region hates you. What would make you want to get up and go there, especially if you weren't, you know, if you were shielded, or, you know, you escaped the Holocaust, and, you know, not in a extremely intolerable situation like in Germany and Central Europe, or in Central and Eastern Europe prior to World War II. Like, why would you want to go there when you can live a better and safer life in America, in New York?
Right, in Brooklyn.
You have to be pretty fanatical to want to get up and move there. And you have to be a pretty big fanatic to want to get up and move and settle, you know, the West Bank, and, you know, kick someone out of their home. Mm. So I think it was a requirement for Israel to kind of mix their secular nationalism with a religious flavor to attract more Jews across the world. That's my theory on it, and why it happened, and you know, why there was this merger between secular Zionism and religious Zionism.
I guess the question really is like whether it was manufactured or if that's just the natural conclusion.
I don't really know enough to say it was manufactured, but it's definitely a interesting topic to explore, you know, is how this, you know, how exactly this happens. Like, you know, if you go back to Christian Zionism, like how was the Christian Zionist movement created? Well, in Protestantism, there had always been these types of overtones of an interest in the Jews in the Bible, you know? Mm-hmm. So Christian Zionism was kind of a outgrowth of that, but then there was this merger of the religious in British society and the Jewish Zionist political movement in Austria and you know, the rest of Europe. There was this merger of it, and you know, at that time the Christian block of that was the ones that were more motivated.
They were the religious zealots, yeah.
Messianic type of religious flavor. The Jews were motivated more so by the persecution that they were facing across Europe. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons. It's an interesting topic to fully explore. I don't really have a good answer to whether it was manufactured or not.
I don't think we're qualified to answer that question either. So,
but I'm sure there's a lot of stuff on the internet you could find. But all right, so going back. So after the 73 war, Jewish settlements were rapidly expanding. And there was this movement called Gush, I believe it's pronounced Emunim. Gush Emunim. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. But it means block of faithful. And this group they would lobby for the expansion of settlements and the rebuilding of the third temple on the Temple Mount. When Menachem Begin became Likud leader and prime minister in 1977, he was in a coalition with the religious right. And he started speaking of the occupied territories as part of Eretz Israel, so the land of Israel, to be settled by a new generation of Israelis, making the land non-negotiable. So needless to say, the settler movement inevitably came into violent confrontations with the Palestinians, which again, which really culminates into the uprising or rebellion or Intifada of 1987. And this uprising brought into prominence this new generation of activists who are connected with mosques and religious institutions, and among them was Hamas, which is a Muslim Brotherhood group. And we did a whole episode on the origins of Hamas, and I don't want to get too into that now, but the Israelis, they fostered the growth of Hamas. They didn't invent Hamas,
right?
But
no, they just promoted it.
They promoted it as a organization to really, at first it was really to split up the PLO or to be a bulwark against the PLO, because the PLO was sponsored by the Soviet Union, and they had some real power when you think about that. They didn't really care as much about the religious fanatics. They would actually even use the religious fanatics to beat up on communist or socialist types who would be advocating for freedom or advocating for civil rights and things like that. So they fostered that, but this starts to turn in the 80s, where Hamas kind of turns against Israel. So I'll quote this. This is an interesting quote. So this is a quote from Professor Salim Mansour, who just published an article recently. It was called "Rabin's Murder is the Prehistory of Gaza, Israel 10/7." So I'm going to read directly from him. "The Intifada also becomes the conduit for supporters of Hamas to organize the politics of resistance in terms of the brotherhood ideology of jihad. Gush Eminim, uses of the terminology Eretz Israel, land of Israel, meaning the land over which Jews claim historical rights, and for them to redeem and settle, was countered in the Hamas charter that all Palestine is Islamic Waqf. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right as well. I think it's Waqf, a religious endowment, consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day, and hence cannot be despoiled, squandered, given, or taken away from Muslims by anyone."
Let me pause you right there before you continue. Just to make that absolutely clear, what he's saying is that both groups are claiming the same land as a religious or historical right to their people at this point. So both the Palestinians and the Jews.
And just whenever somebody tells you that this is a century-long conflict that has to do with religion, just slap them in the face. Say, no. The religious element doesn't happen until the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And 80s, really. This is not fundamentally this is more of a racial war. Mm-hmm. But that took on, this is more of a racial war than a religious war. Mm-hmm. Took on
this is when they started
religious flavor.
This is when they just started using that religiously charged language, right? The Israelis are using the term Eretz Israel, or land of Israel, which is just has this religious overtone to it, or historic overtone, and the Palestinians are calling Palestine the Islamic Waqf, which is the religious endowment. Again, so they're just using this charged language at this point to refer to this land and stake a claim to it from a religious or historical perspective.
Yeah, and remember, the Muslim Brotherhood is, and their whole goal is to, create Islamic political power and the different countries that they operate in. Now, as Hamas...
You're continuing the quote here, right?
I'm continuing the quote. So, as Hamas gained popularity, it posed a threat to secular nationalist appeal of the PLO, a threat that its enemies among Arab states in the region, including Israel, would exploit to create divisions among Palestinians. Israeli intelligence agencies, Mossad and Shin Bet, would have been negligent in failing to penetrate Hamas with informers and goad Hamas activists escalate the rhetoric of religious extremists and terrorist violence to outflank the PLO from the right. Rabin had failed during his time as defense minister to impede the settler movement in the territories that came to haunt him as a prime minister. After signing the Oslo Accords, Rabin was a marked man, his death foretold. The Intifada had taken the lid off domestic terrorism. Gush Eminyan and the ultra-religious right in Israel had found in Hamas their partner in the zero-sum dance of mutual hate and violence. Within 6 months of the signing of the Oslo Accords, the ring of fire was ablaze. So, even to this day, there's all these quotes about how there's all these direct quotes from Benjamin Netanyahu saying how we need Hamas, and Hamas delegitimizes the Palestinian cause. And, there's a direct quote that's from Netanyahu who says, "Don't worry if things get out of hand because we control the height of the flame," type thing. So the Likudniks, they needed Hamas to justify not conceding any type of settlement to the Palestinians, because what better excuse is there than that? No, these guys are crazy. We can't work with them. They're not partners for peace. Right.
They don't want to give up any of the land at all. Right. They're useful in making a good argument for keeping the land.
So now you got to note, so with the rise of this new level of religious nationalism, there was, of course, increased levels of confrontations. And there was these confrontations between Hamas and then the extreme settler right-wing groups. And both sides were attempting to thwart the agreement with violent acts. So it wasn't really one-sided. But the starting of this had to do with the Ibrahimi Mosque, which is called the Cave of the Patriarchs. There was this massacre in this mosque by a settler named Baruch Goldstein in 1994. And Salim, he includes this, which a descriptive outline of the event. So at 5:20 a.m. on February 25th, 1994, some 700 Palestinian Arab men, women, and children, having awoken and risen in the dark and eating a quick breakfast, swarmed into the mosque in Hebron for dawn prayers that marked the start of the fast observed from sunrise to sunset on each of the 30 days of Ramadan. Prayers had just started. Worshippers were kneeling forward on a plastic mats, touching foreheads reverently to the floor. While they were praying, Baruch Goldstein, a Jewish settler from the nearby community of Kiryat Arba, arrived on the scene. He was a physician and well-known activist. A year earlier, he had prophesied in a synagogue that there will come a day when a Jew will get up and kill many Arabs for killing Meir Kahane, the Jewish zealot slain in New York City in 1990. Right-wing Jews said many extreme things, and Goldstein's words seemed to be wild rhetoric, but nothing more. As the worshippers continued their prayers, Goldstein silently approached the mosque. He wore a reserve captain's olive green army uniform and a yarmulke on his head, and he carried a military-issue Galil assault rifle. Speaking in Arabic, he asked the Palestinian guard at the door to let him enter, but the guard tried to keep him from going in, arguing that Israelis were forbidden to step inside during the Muslim prayers. Goldstein angrily persisted, "I am the officer in charge here, and I must go in," knocking the guard down with his rifle. But he rushed inside, positioning himself close to the backs of the worshippers in the rear row. Then saying nothing, he opened fire. 7 people died immediately, all shot in the head. Others ran for cover, screaming, calling for help. Goldstein kept up the barrage of bullets for another 10 minutes. In the end, he killed 30 Palestinians. He had been hoping to kill the peace process as well by raising the temperature of the Arab-Israeli conflict to such heights that talking peace would have been impossible. He succeeded, but only temporarily. In their grief and fury, Palestinians were in no mood to talk about implementing the DOP. Now it was just Hamas terror that was threatening to blow up the Oslo Accords. It was the Israeli terror. Let me repeat that. Now it was not just Hamas terror that was threatening to blow up the Oslo Accords. It was Israeli terror as well. So a few weeks later, on April 6th, April 6th, 13 Hamas fighters, they responded with a suicide bomb attack in 2 Israeli towns in Hadira and Afula. And really this begins this tit-for-tat response between both radical sides. The Israeli government responded by making it illegal for Jews to enter major Arab communities in Hebron. But the Israeli government also took extreme measures against Palestinians as well, expelling them from certain streets near Jewish settlements in Hebron, where many Palestinians had homes and businesses, and allowing access exclusively to Jewish Israelis and foreign tourists. Foreign tourist. Why am I saying tourist? Tourist. Foreign tourist.
Well, that's just apartheid 101 right there. So this is where that starts.
But he had mentioned that he was a follower of Rabbi Mahir Kahane, and Mahir Kahane was assassinated by the precursors of Al Qaeda in 1990.
Right.
He was.
We did a whole episode on the assassination of Kahane.
Yeah, we did. We had actually a pretty extensive episode on this guy's background almost a year ago, and he was Kahane was an advocate for essentially ethnically cleansing all the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Mm-hmm. He has this book called, he has many books, but his most famous book, the most striking one, is called They Must Go.
You can guess what that must be about.
They Must Go. The book title.
Yep.
And but even in Israel, he was considered a big problem, and he was jailed dozens of times. He had this political party called Koch, or Koch.
Cock.
And after two failed attempts to be elected in the Knesset, he actually succeeded in 1984. And I took some of the notes from the last episode we did. Just some of the policies he was advocating. So one was a law forbidding the abomination of assimilation and communion with Goyim. So in this case, Arabs. Another one, a mandatory prison sentence for any Arab who had sexual relations with a Jewish girl or woman.
That's nuts.
3, a law restricting UN forces from engaging in any type of relations with the Jewish populations. And in addition, Kahane later declared that if elected, he would strip all Israel Arabs of their citizenship and work toward expelling any who refused to relinquish it. So he was
nuts.
He was a real crazed guy, and he was involved in other groups. He's from the United States, and he was the founder of the Jewish Defense League, and the Jewish Defense League was like this response to not really the Arab-Israeli conflict, but more so the migration of blacks into cities, into Jewish communities. And it was like a organization that stood up for Jews who were being mugged and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But it kind of eventually turned into this real crazy organization that was involved in terrorist attacks around global terrorism and things like that. Like they were nuts. they were labeled a racist party, and Kahane was removed of his parliamentary post.
Yep. The Knesset, by the way, is the folks that labeled his group a racist party. So it wasn't
the Knesset itself labeled him they were too far right.
Right.
For
They're like, nah, you're racist.
For the Knesset. So
which at the time and still was pretty far right. Yeah. I mean, this is all really good context, but we started this episode talking about how we're going to talk about the assassination of Rabin, and we haven't even gotten to it yet. An hour in.
I know, but you need to understand the context of what he was going up against with the peace.
I agree.
Just we could just do an episode and being like, okay, he was assassinated on this day. This was the gunman. This is what happened. Right. But the more important part is why someone did it.
Right. Exactly.
But now we're going to get onto the actual assassination.
Let's get into it. So the opposition to Rabin's government in the Knesset was led by none other than our favorite prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And he was elected to replace Yitzhak Shamir as the Likud leader following the June 1992 election. Netanyahu led the Likud to join a broader coalition that spanned across a broad right-wing spectrum of Israeli politics against basically the Oslo Accords. And this coalition was spearheaded by the Yesha Council, the organization of West Bank and Gaza settlers, and also anchored by hardliners in that group, Gush Emunim, the group that we can barely pronounce. The Oslo Accords was a serious threat, though, to their objective of turning the occupied territories into a part of Eretz Israel. So, the opposition's tactics to derail the Oslo Accords, according to Itamar Rabinovich, who was the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., said, and I quote, it unfolded in several stages: legitimate political opposition, illegitimate political opposition, discrediting and delegitimizing the government and its leader, dehumanization of the political rival, symbolic conduct and ritual murder, violent political conduct, and actual assassination. This is where Itamar Rabinovich, that Israeli ambassador to the U.S., is saying these were the tactics to derail the Oslo Accords, which is just, I mean, they really must not have liked it to go as far as ritual murder. But yeah, Rabin's government was branded by the opposition coalition as a word Judenrat, which is a smear against the Jews who collaborated with the Nazis. Even Ariel Sharon turned against Rabin, who had a personal and professional relationship through the military. Sharon accused...
Ariel Sharon, he's a complicated history, but he wasn't as keen on making, he was Likud as well, but he wasn't as he was a military guy as well, like Rabin. So he had a professional relationship, through their military experience with Rabin. But he turned against the Rabin government as well.
Right. He actually
not to say that Sharon's a good guy. I'm just saying Sharon.
No, it's just
Sharon is like, one of the most Machiavellian Israeli politicians of all time.
But he ends up accusing Rabin's government as an insane government that shrinks Israel to Auschwitz borders, a reckless government, submissive, confused, treacherous, insane. This is how Sharon describes Rabin's government. Basically, at this point, nothing could have put the genie back in the bottle after October 19th, 1994. There was this Hamas suicide bombing of a bus in Tel Aviv that killed 22 Israelis and wounded just as many. And
I remember that as like a really young baby too.
Yeah.
Like I was just like, that's
news.
like one of my first like political memories is like, or maybe it didn't. Maybe I was a little older. or it was a couple years after I learned about it. But it was like one of the first things I ever learned about Israel was that suicide bombing.
Mm-hmm. And at that bombing, Netanyahu ends up appearing at the site and addresses to the television cameras and basically denounces Rabin and says, the prime minister chose to prefer Arafat and the welfare of Gaza's residents at the expense of the inhabitants of Israel. Basically saying like, this guy let it happen, right? Because he wanted to, kowtow to the Gazans, to the Palestinians. And so,
can I tell you something that's kind of fucked up?
All right.
So when I was a kid, I was pro-Israel because I thought that Arafat looked like this like little goblin man.
I mean, he kind of does look like a little goblin.
Am I wrong to say that?
No, I mean,
I remember just like
wrong.
seeing him on the news and be like, "Oh, who's this goblin man?"
I mean, looks alone, he kind of does look like a goblin. I mean, in fairness, sure, he kind of is a goblin, but that's it has nothing to do with what he looks like. You're excused as a child, I guess. Okay, where was I? So these extremist factions, not fascists, extremist factions within Israel, they start intensifying their let's call it agitation against Rabin. The rabbis of these ultra-Orthodox Jews heightened the tension by basically incorporating two controversial principles into the discourse. One of them was called the law of the pursuer, or din rodif, and the other one was called the law of the informer, din moser. I'm going to explain what those are. Actually, I'll let Itamar Rabinovich explain it for us. I'll quote him. He says, both laws were adopted from the long history of the Jews in the diaspora and under foreign rule, and both sanctioned the killing of a Jew who either pursued or prosecuted other Jews or informed on them to Gentile authorities. So basically, these are just two historically Jewish laws that let you kill a Jew if, basically Jewish snitches get stitches is what this was. And a week after that Tel Aviv bombing on October 26th, King Hussein of Jordan and Rabin end up signing the Jordanian-Israel peace treaty. Then in December 1994, Rabin, accompanied by Shimon Peres and joined by Arafat, they all receive the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in Norway. And as the year 1995 opened the opposition to Rabin and the Oslo Accords, it grew increasingly belligerent. These Orthodox rabbis in the diaspora were basically bringing up this law of the pursuer and law of the informer, and we're basically throwing it out there and saying like, hey, does this count? is someone snitching, or is someone persecuting or prosecuting against Jews here? Should this apply? And so in September of 95, negotiations to expand the area in stages under the Palestinian Authority with the West Bank began. Beyond Jericho, that is, was known as Oslo Number 2, and that gets signed in Washington. And this incremental handover of the West Bank territory to the PA was separated into three distinct areas that we know now, areas A, B, and C. And Oslo 2 also marked basically the speed or the momentum for reaching the final status agreement. On October 5th, the Knesset was scheduled to vote on Oslo Number 2, and that opposition called for a mass rally on the same day in Zion Square in Jerusalem. Now, in that rally, Likud and other right-wing groups held other rallies where they showed Rabin in a Nazi uniform or as a target, and they compared his party to Nazis and called him Hitler, and they were calling him a murderer and a traitor. And in this particular rally, however, and I think we've talked about this on the show once before, but Netanyahu led a mock funeral for Rabin with a coffin where people were shouting death to Rabin. And this in particular gives me like real Jan 6 vibes when those like right wingers brought a gallows to the rally. Super dangerous imagery. But yeah, Netanyahu was out there saying like, pretending like Rabin was already dead. I don't know what that signals to you, but for me, it doesn't sound very good. And so the security chief warned Netanyahu about there being threats to Rabin's life and asked him to like chill out and tone it down. But Netanyahu didn't really do that. And although he denied trying to stir up any violence, he definitely didn't tone it down. And so
isn't that it's just crazy?
It's fucking nuts, right? Like, literally, what? I mean, like I said, it gives me real Jan 6 vibes, right? Like, some of them weren't out there.
It gives me way worse than Jan 6 vibes. It gives me like,
well, that's just like the contemporary example. Like, I don't know, they definitely weren't out there to like change governments, right? Like, they're out there for blood, so
it gives me like I'm trying to think of a good comparison. What
well, it's like
Herbert of the French Revolution or someone like that. Like,
sure,
somebody.
It's also like the cross burnings, or like putting a rope in a tree, during a rally for
it's not, but
KKK
it goes past a rabble rousing, I disagree with you strongly,
right?
Rally,
and it's like,
it sounds
I want you to
more
die.
of like a call for death. And
right. I mean, literally, they were calling for death. They were saying death to Rabin.
Yeah,
that's literally what they were saying. So
it's like the equivalent of like when a Brazilian soccer player like misses a penalty kick or something like that.
Right. And then they start like showing up at his house with like fucking guns and shit. But yeah, so in that particular rally, Rabin's car ends up getting mobbed near the Knesset, but ultimately he survives that specific episode. Not too much longer, about a month later, on November 4th, Rabin and Perez were at a peace rally in Malkai Yisrael Square near the city hall in Tel Aviv. And this one didn't go so
And Shimon Peres is his foreign minister, by the way. I don't know if we said that yet.
Yeah, I think we did earlier, but thanks for bringing that up again.
So this one didn't go so well. This guy who we brought up at the beginning of the episode, Yigal Amir, he had been stalking Rabin since the beginning of the signing of the Oslo Accords in Washington in September of '93. And Amir was in his mid-20s, law student, real extreme views. He believed that giving up the West Bank was like denying Jews their historical rights. And he saw Rabin as a threat to Jews there under Din Rodef law that we were talking about that was kicked around by a lot of those religious types, basically saying like, oh, this guy is like persecuting or prosecuting against the Jews, so he deserves to die. So here's what went down. After the rally, Rabin was heading to his car, and just as he was getting in, Amir came up from behind him and shot him twice with a Beretta pistol, and Rabin got hit in his stomach and in his chest. Amir was quickly tackled by Rabin's bodyguards and cops, but not before he accidentally shot one of the bodyguards, Yoram Rubin, who luckily only got a minor injury. Amir was arrested right there with the gun, and Rabin was not in great shape. He was super limp. His bodyguards and the driver, Menachem Damadi, they tried to rush him to the hospital. The driver was super stressed. He even got a bit lost on the way there, ran some red lights, the whole deal. It was a crazy commotion. And Rabin was initially conscious at first, saying he didn't think he was too badly hurt, but then he ends up passing out, and they finally got him to the hospital about 10 minutes after the shooting. At the hospital, also super chaotic scene. Rabin wasn't breathing. He didn't have a pulse. Doctors tried their best, but, they even got his pulse back at one point. So he was back up, and Rabin went into surgery at that point. But there was this brief moment of hope when Rabin's condition seemed stable, but it went downhill super fast. There was a pretty desperate attempt by the surgeons to basically save his life, but he couldn't be saved, and he was pronounced dead an hour and a half later after he was shot. And Eitan Haber, he then had to go out and announce the fact that Rabin was gone, and he said that the government of Israel announces in deep sorrow the death of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered tonight in Tel Aviv. Which could have seen that coming, given that they were out there saying death to Rabin, right? But interesting fact, they found a blood-stained paper with the lyrics to Shir La Shalom, or Song for Peace, in Rabin's pocket. And the song is actually about the need for peace, because you can't bring back the dead. It's a little bit of a tragic irony there. So, in the aftermath of this, in the Israeli settlements, people were debating about, whether or not this was okay, right? Whether or not this Din Rodef law, the snitches get stitches law, that this applied to Rabin and to the Oslo Accords broadly. And some thought that Amir got the go-ahead from a rabbi for the assassination, but that part isn't super clear. Amir's dad even said that Amir kept saying Rabin should be killed under this law. And in his trial, Amir said that he did it under that law, Din Rodef, and that it wasn't personal, and it was just so that we can get Rabin out of power. And the Israeli Security Service, Shin Bet, they had an eye on Amir for trying to start an anti-Arab group separately, but they missed a lot of his comments about wanting to kill Rabin, which he said to a bunch of people. They ignored a bunch of warning signs too. Anyway, Amir ends up getting life in prison plus some extra time for injuring the bodyguard, which, at that point, what does it matter? And his sentence wasn't reduced, which is super unusual in Israel. And he seemed pretty happy about what he did. He even asked for a drink to celebrate it. And the police also arrested Amir's brother, Haggai, and another accomplice by the name of Dror Adani. Hagani got 16 years in jail, and Adani got 7. It turns out that one of the well-known right-wing extremists, Avishai Raviv, was actually an informant for Shin Bet, but he was acquitted in court for charges related to the assassination. And that's what went down.
Well, all these right-wing groups have informants from their state polices or their federal polices, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence. But this is, in my opinion, this is kind of the turning point in the entire conflict, because I don't think nothing like this could happen today, like the current conflict right now. I don't know what the death toll is going to be by the time this releases, but right now we're around 22,000 or so. This wouldn't fly. This wouldn't happen. I don't think this would happen 30 years ago. But it's a tragedy. It's not only a tragedy because I think Yitzhak Rabin really gave it an honest. He gave the impossible task of preserving Israel as a Jewish state with creating a lasting peace. He gave it an honest shot, and there were a lot of Israelis a lot of reputations on the line, who were giving this an honest shot, and he was killed because of it. So if there's no way out, if there's no political solution, if a prime minister of Israel was okay, we're in this, the Palestinian conflict is we're past a military solution right now. We need to find a political solution. Would they just be assassinated? Is that the consequence of seeking a peace?
Well, I mean, it
'Cause it's-
sounds like it, especially and I don't know what the political or religious zeitgeist is right now in Israel, but it's pretty far right wing right now. So I can imagine that they'd still be talking about those laws, those din rodif or whatever laws, if someone decided like, hey, let's stop, you know. Um, I feel like they would get the same treatment as Rabin did, for at least from some groups in Israel.
Yeah, and now now these groups are way more organized than they used to be, and they actually have real positions of power. So it's just,
Yeah, we got that guy. Who's that guy that wanted to make his? I forget his name. He wanted to make his own paramilitary force in the West Bank.
Itamar Ben Gavir and Smotrich, who's the Minister of Finance. But it's Ben Gavir is out of the picture right now, but Smotrich is still in power. But I mean, I don't know. It's like every time we do one of these episodes, it's like, yeah, well, what would you do if you were? It's like, I have no idea. It seems like we're beyond the peace. It seems like the Israelis right now are just saying, hey, I mean, here's what I can't put my tongue on right now is this more of like a Netanyahu thing? Like, I need to do this to stay in power, or is this really like across the board what a lot of high-up people and the defense establishment or political establishment feel is the only solution is to just like make Gaza so inhabitable that they have to move into the Sinai? But the thing is, though, is that
I think it could be both, right? I mean, just like how, the intersection of the secular Zionists, got together with the right wing religious, components of Israel to push for expansion of settlements. I think it could be both, right? Just before this October 7th, like, and even Israel was kind of in rocky place. Netanyahu's government was kind of in a rocky place. I mean, how many? There's been 5 elections in 3 years or something like that, right? Like, Netanyahu definitely wasn't in a strong amount of power, and he had to kowtow to a lot of these right wing zealots to get the power that he needed to maintain a government. And even before that, he was in a hell of a lot of trouble, for breaking laws and shit,
for flagrant corruption.
Flagrant corruptions, right? So, I think, and if you look at his history here, right? Like, I mean, this is nothing new for him. I mean, he was chanting death to the guy. He led that fake funeral for the guy that wanted peace, or that at least wanted to give it a shot. And we're not saying that Rabin was this like.
And the peace wasn't the peace wasn't like no perfect peace or anything like that. It wasn't like, oh, this is going to be a sovereign nation. It was really just kind of autonomy, but it was 100% preferable to anything that's going on right now, and
100% preferable to occupation and genocide.
The thing that we'll see how this plays out, really, but the end game, and I've said this earlier, I said the Israelis can't kill their way out of this. Let's just say if they push, I don't know, they're going to push 2 million people out of Gaza. That still leaves the West Bank. But now these people, if they're in the Sinai, you have all these guys who are probably Hamas, who are sympathetic to Hamas, and probably Hamas's recruitment is going to be at an all-time high after this. Now they have access to the Red Sea, and you don't control their coastline. So anyone who knows anything about the region, that region in the Red Sea, across Yemen, across Somalia, across all these countries in the Horn of Africa, something that they have a lot of is weapons. And it will be way easier to arm a Palestinian resistance who was headquartered in the Sinai than it would be to arm one that's in That's in Gaza.
Even like Egypt struggles to like have control over the Sinai Peninsula. There's a lot of fucked up things that happens in the Sinai Peninsula. It's like in the south, along the Red Sea, it's like a bunch of like resorts and shit, and all over the north, it's just like fucking black market smuggling, weapons, like it's where people go to like hide. It's crazy.
Yeah. So you're saying like, oh, let's give them the Sinai.
Give them the place where there is no rules and no one can, check them.
I feel like that would be the ultimate security risk for them, because now and especially if there's ways for them to, I mean, they couldn't secure the border. They couldn't secure the border, this relatively small fence. They're not going to be able to create a border immediately.
Hundreds or 1,000 miles of Sinai desert.
So we're talking about like, what is it going to be, like endless military excursions into the Sinai fighting Hamas guys? The Israelis can't do that. They can't really project outside of their borders, except for airstrikes and stuff like that. But they can't invade. I mean, they don't have the ability to really invade anything that's outside of their occupied territories. They could bomb the shit out of things, but to get these guys, you have to, go down and actually kill them.
Well, I mean, if they're not in Israel proper, they could just nuke them. That could be an option.
They can't. They're not going to nuke the Sinai Desert. It's too close to them. That's a last resort type of thing. But that would be real crazy if they did. Okay, let's wrap this episode up, because it's getting to almost 12, and the likelihood of saying something dumb, it goes up 200%.
I'm sure we've already said plenty of dumb shit at this point, so cut our losses, right?
Okay, guys, thanks again for listening to another episode of Bro History. We always appreciate your company. Make sure that you rate and review the podcast if you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify. Follow us, subscribe, and you can also join our Patreon, get access to our Slack channel. Danny, anything else to add?
Nope.
All right. Peace, guys.